Asterisk, asterisk. Part 1. The Snowbound Night and the Broken Promise. Asterisk, asterisk. The wind had teeth tonight. Cole Hartman felt them through his sheepskin coat as he made the final check of the northern fence line. It was a ritual born of loss, a habit etched into the hollow spaces of his days. The wire, strung taut between posts he'd driven into the earth with his own hands, hummed a low, mournful tune against the gale. Each post was a sentinel, each strand of wire a promise he made to what was left the land. The cattle, the crushing, profound silence of his house. Willow Bluff, Montana Territory, was being buried alive. Winter in 1887 had come not as a gentle blanket, but as an invading army, laying siege to the Powder River Basin. Snow, driven horizontally by the wind, erased the world, blurring the line between earth and sky from the distant pines. The high, lonesome cry of a wolf pack drifted, a sound that no longer chilled him. It was just another voice in the emptiness. He cinched his hat lower, the frozen leather stiff against his brow, and turned his horse. Zeus, back toward the distant, solitary light of the ranch house. The beam from the window was a pinprick of gold in an endless expanse of white and gray. It promised warmth, but not comfort. There was no comfort left in that house, not since the diphtheria had come and gone 2 years prior, taking his wife, Eleanor, and their 6-year-old son, Thomas, with it. It had scoured him out, leaving a man who owned 6,000 acres of prime grazing land and a herd of Hereford that were the envy of the county, yet possessed nothing at all. He ran his ranch with a quiet efficiency that masked the void. He was a good boss to his men, Hank and Luther, but a stranger to himself. His heart was a locked room, the key long lost. Inside, he stomped the snow from his boots and hung his coat. The fire in the great stone hearth crackled, spitting embers onto the stone. It was the only reply to the howl of the wind. He poured a measure of whiskey into a tin cup, the amber liquid doing little to warm the cold that lived deep in his bones. He was 34 years old and felt ancient. He sat in his worn leather chair, the one Eleanor had always claimed was his throne, and stared into the flames. He was a ghost in his own life, and the storm outside was merely a reflection of the one within. He was checking his fences, patrolling his borders, but the real threat had breached his walls long ago and taken everything. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Miles away, another soul fought the same storm, but with none of Cole's defenses. Abigail Rowan ran. She didn't know where she was going, only what she was fleeing. The word husband was a brand on her mind. The name Silas Burke, a curse on her lips, tasted with every frozen breath she gasped. The wedding dress was a cruel joke. Its fine lace, meant for a chapel, was snagged and torn by sagebrush she couldn't see beneath the snow. The delicate satin slippers were shredded, her feet numb inside them. Her father had insisted she wear it for the journey to Burke's mansion. A bride should look like a bride when she is delivered to her husband, he had said, his eyes not quite meeting hers. Delivered, like a piece of cargo. She was 19, but tonight she felt as breakable as a child. An hour ago, she had been standing in the shadows of the hallway in her father's modest home, listening. Her father, a man broken by debt and ambition, was finalizing the terms of her sale. "The dowry is small. Silas, you know my means are limited," her father had murmured, his voice thin with deference. Silas Burke's voice was the opposite, deep, resonant, and slick with the oil of power. "The cash is irrelevant. Martin, it's the mining concession that matters. Your signature on that paper, granting my company exclusive rights to the Blue Creek vein, is the only dowry I require. Abigail is the seal on the deal." A seal, a stamp on a contract. That's all she was. The man she was promised to, a man more than twice her age with a reputation for ruthlessness in his railroad and mining ventures, saw her as nothing more than an object to complete a transaction. The knowledge had been a physical blow. All the vague fears she'd harbored about this arranged marriage coalesced into a single, sharp point of terror. She had backed away from the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Her room, her whole life, felt like a cage whose door was about to be bolted shut forever. Panic gave her a clarity she hadn't known she possessed. She wouldn't be a seal on a deal. She wouldn't be delivered. Her escape was a frantic, clumsy blur. She had no time for a proper coat, only her mother's old woolen shawl, into a simple cloth satchel. She shoved the one thing of value she owned, a worn copy of Jane Eyre *, her mother's favorite, its pages filled with a hope and defiance she desperately needed now. Her hands swept across the small writing desk in the study where the men had been, knocking a sealed envelope to the floor. Without thinking, driven by pure, unadulterated haste, she scooped it up and shoved it into the bag with the book. Then, she slipped out the back door and into the maw of the blizzard. Now, the cold was a predator, sinking its claws into her. Every step was a battle. The snow was a shifting, treacherous sea that reached her knees, pulling at her, trying to drag her down and hold her until she slept. She clutched the bag to her chest, the corner of the book a hard, reassuring pressure against her ribs. The only other token of her old life was a simple blue kerchief tied around her wrist, a gift from her mother long ago. It was a flimsy shield against the world, but it was hers. The fear was a living thing inside her, but beneath it, a tiny, hard kernel of anger was forming. It was the anger of the cornered, the fury of the voiceless. She was a runaway, a piece of property that had stolen itself. In the eyes of the law and society, she was in the wrong. The thought brought a wave of shame so powerful it almost buckled her knees. But then the image of Silas Burke's satisfied smile as he spoke of her as a seal rose in her mind, and the anger burned brighter, giving her the strength for another step, and another. She had no map, no destination. She was just moving away from Willow Bluff, away from the railroad tracks that were a testament to Burke's power. Crawling like an iron snake across the land, she stumbled, falling hard into a drift. The impact drove the air from her lungs. For a moment, she lay there, the snow a deceptively soft bed. It would be so easy to close her eyes, to let the white silence take her. No. The word was a silent scream in her head. She pushed herself up, her muscles screaming in protest. And that's when she saw it. A light, faint, flickering, impossibly far, but it was there, a single point of reference in the swirling chaos. It was hope. It became her entire world. She fixed her eyes on it, blocking out the pain, the cold, the howling of the wind. She didn't walk anymore. She waited, she crawled. She fought her way toward that distant spark. The journey was an eternity. Her mind began to drift, her body a machine running on its last reserves of fuel. The light grew, separated from the storm, taking the shape of a window, a house. When she finally staggered onto the porch, she was moving on memory alone. Her legs gave out, and she fell against the heavy oak door. She raised a hand that felt like a club of ice and knocked. The sound was pathetic, a feeble scratching swallowed by the storm. She tried again, putting the last of her strength into it. A solid, desperate thud. Then the world tilted, and darkness rushed in at the edges of her vision. Asterisk. The sound was what pulled Cole from his trance. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. A dull, rhythmic thump against the door. He sat straighter in his chair, his senses, honed by years of solitude, on high alert. No one traveled in a storm like this. No one sane. Anyway, he stood, pulling the Winchester from its pegs by the door. He didn't expect trouble, but in this territory, you met the unexpected with readiness. He moved to the door, his stockinged feet silent on the wooden floorboards. The thumping came again, weaker this time. He lifted the heavy bar, his hand resting on the cold steel of the rifle. He pulled the door inward. At first, he thought it was a snowdrift that had somehow piled against the entrance. Then the drift moved, collapsing inward with a soft sigh. It was a person, a woman, from the shape of her, entombed in white. He leaned the rifle against the wall and knelt, brushing the snow away. He saw a face so pale it was almost translucent, framed by dark, wet hair plastered to her skin. Her lips were blue. She was wearing the tattered remains of a white dress, a garment so utterly wrong for the time and place it was jarring. She was young, frightfully young. A primal instinct, one he thought had been buried with his family, surged through him. He scooped her into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, a bundle of cold limbs and wet fabric. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the storm that had delivered her. He laid her gently on the bearskin rug before the hearth, the firelight dancing over her still form. For a moment, he was paralyzed by a ghost of a memory, another pale face, another labored breath. Asterisk, Eleanor. Asterisk. He shook his head, forcing the image away. This was not then, this was now. His hands worked with a detached practicality. He had to get her warm. He carefully worked the frozen shawl from her shoulders. The dress was soaked through, clinging to her like a second skin. It was a useless, flimsy thing. With a grimace, he took his hunting knife and slit the ruined fabric up the side, enough to pull it away from her skin without exposing her more than necessary. Underneath, she wore a simple chemise, also cold and damp. He rose and fetched a pile of thick wool blankets from a nearby chest. He wrapped her tightly, swaddling her like a child, leaving only her face exposed. He chafed her hands, trying to force life back into the frozen fingers. One of her hands was clenched around the strap of a small cloth bag. Even in unconsciousness, she held on. He sat back on his heels, watching her. Her breathing was shallow but steady. The color was slowly, almost imperceptibly, returning to her cheeks. The firelight softened the hard lines of his own face, revealing not just the weariness, but the profound loneliness etched there. The storm raged outside, a wild beast trying to get in, but inside, for the first time in 2 years, the silence of the house was broken. It was broken by the quiet, rhythmic breathing of the stranger who lay before his fire. He didn't know her name, or where she had come from, or what trouble she was running from. He only knew that the blizzard had thrown her at his door, and he had let her in. His gaze fell to the small satchel she still clutched. He felt a faint curiosity, but pushed it aside. It was her business. For now, his only business was to keep this fragile life from being extinguished by the storm. As he added another log to the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, he felt something stir in the frozen landscape of his heart. It wasn't warmth. Not yet. It was something quieter, a sense of purpose, fragile as an ember. In the heart of the long, cold night, the snow continued to fall, burying the tracks of the past, hiding the path she had taken, and obscuring the one that lay ahead for them both. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 2, The Warm Porch and the Fragile Boundary. Asterisk, asterisk. Abigail awoke to the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee. The world came back to her not in a rush, but as a slow, creeping warmth that started in her chest and spread outward to her limbs. For a moment, she thought she was in a dream. The ceiling above her was made of thick, dark beams, and the air was filled with a profound quiet, broken only by the crackle of a nearby fire and the gentle hiss of the wind outside. She tried to sit up, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. A soft gasp escaped her lips. Easy now. The voice was a low baritone, calm and steady. It came from a man sitting in a leather armchair by the fire, a tin cup of coffee cradled in his large, calloused hands. It was Cole Hartman. He watched her not with menace, but with a quiet, assessing gaze. His face, etched by sun and sorrow, held a deep weariness, but his eyes were clear and direct. Before Abby could find her voice, the front door opened, letting in a swirl of cold air and another figure. It was a woman, stamping snow from her boots. She was younger than Cole, with the same dark hair and determined set to her jaw, but her eyes held a warmth that her brother's lacked. "She's awake then," the woman said, unwrapping a scarf from her neck. "Good. I came as fast as I could. Cole, the drifts are halfway up the fences by Miller's Creek." "Naomi, this is—" Cole paused, realizing he didn't know her name. "Abigail?" she whispered, her voice raspy. She pushed herself up on her elbows, clutching the thick wool blanket to her chin. She was wearing a simple flannel nightgown, much too large for her, but wonderfully warm. Abigail Rowan. Naomi approached and knelt by her side, her touch gentle as she felt Abby's forehead. "No fever. That's a mercy. You were half frozen, girl. My brother said he found you collapsed on the porch." Her tone was practical, but not unkind. "You need to get some broth in you." Cole had already ladled some into a bowl from a pot simmering over the fire. He handed it to his sister, who then offered it to Abby. The hot, salty liquid was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. It sent a shock of life through her, chasing away the last of the deep, numbing cold. As she drank, she took in her surroundings. The main room of the ranch house was vast and masculine, built of log and stone. A long dining table sat in the center, surrounded by sturdy chairs. Bookshelves filled with worn volumes lined one wall. It was a place of substance, of permanence. It felt safe. The feeling was so foreign, so welcome, that it brought tears to her eyes. "What were you doing out in that storm?" Abigail Cole asked, his voice still even, but with an edge of inquiry he could no longer suppress. The question hung in the air. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her again. She couldn't tell them the whole truth. They would cast her out, and she had nowhere else to go. She took a shaky breath, choosing her words as if walking across a frozen creek. I was on my way to be married," she began, her voice gaining a little strength. She looked from Cole's guarded expression to Naomi's more sympathetic one. "It was an arrangement. Not of my choosing." She stopped, swallowing hard. Then she looked directly at Cole, her eyes pleading. "He was not a good man. I couldn't do it. She was promised to another. She said—" the phrase feeling both true and strangely distant, as if describing someone else. And I ran. "Please, I have nowhere to go. Just a few days. Just until the storm passes and I can think what to do." The silence that followed was heavy. Cole's face was unreadable. He was a man accustomed to weighing risks, the risk of a late frost, of cattle disease, of a bad market. Now he was weighing the risk of her. A runaway bride was trouble. A bride promised to a powerful man was a declaration of war. It was Naomi who spoke first. "Cole, you can't send her back out there. It would be a death sentence." He didn't look at his sister. His eyes remained on Abby. He saw the terror in her gaze. But he also saw something else, a flicker of steel, the same stubborn refusal to break that he saw in a sapling bent low by the wind. He had built this ranch to be a fortress against the world, a place where he could be left alone with his ghosts. But his father had taught him that a man's strength wasn't just in the fences he built, but in the shelter he offered. "You can stay," he said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. "The storm's not letting up for days. You can have the couch here by the fire." He gestured with his cup. "My room is upstairs. Naomi will stay in the spare room for now." He was drawing lines, creating boundaries. This was charity, not an invitation. "You'll be safe here." Relief washed over Abby so completely she felt weak with it. "Thank you," she breathed. "Thank you." Later that evening, after Naomi had helped her wash and dress in some of her own borrowed clothes, Abby watched Cole step out onto the front porch. He returned a moment later, having hung something from the eaves, A soft, metallic clinking sound now joined the howl of the wind. "What is that?" she asked. "Wind chimes," he answered, not looking at her. "Eleanor, my wife, she liked them. I took them down after—" He paused, the silence stretching. "They'll let us know if anyone rides up. The wind will tell us if a stranger comes." It was both a comfort and a warning. The house was a shelter, but it was also a garrison. The gentle chimes were sentinels, guarding the fragile peace. Over the next few days, as the snow continued to fall, trapping them in a world of white, Abby began to see the true nature of the man who had taken her in. The Hartman Ranch was not just a piece of land. It was a kingdom, and Cole was its quiet, deliberate ruler. She watched from the window as he and his two loyal ranch hands, a gruff older man named Hank and a wiry young man called Luther, moved with practiced efficiency. Their days dictated by the needs of the animals. They cleared paths to the barns, forked hay to the shivering cattle, and ensured the water troughs weren't frozen solid. There was a rhythm to the place, a sense of order and purpose that soothed Abby's frayed nerves. She saw Cole in the barn, his hands gentle on a newborn calf. She saw him at the long dining table in the evening, sharing a meal with his men, listening to their concerns. He paid them well, she heard Hank say as much to Naomi, and cared for Luther's wife and two small children, who lived in a small cabin a short distance away. This was not a man who saw people as assets on a ledger. He was a rich cowboy. Yes, but his wealth was in the land, in his herd, and in the loyalty he earned, not the power he wielded. Eager to not be a burden, Abby looked for ways to help. She was no rancher's daughter, but she could cook and clean, and she insisted on taking over the kitchen duties from a grateful Naomi. It was in the evenings that she found her true value. She saw Cole poring over a large, leather-bound ledger, a frown creasing his brow. The columns of numbers were a chaotic scrawl. "Is something wrong?" she asked tentatively one night. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I can track a herd across 100 miles of open country, but I can't make these numbers behave. This is the tally for the spring cattle drive. Costs against potential profit. It's a mess. May I see?" He looked at her, surprised, but pushed the book across the table. Her father, for all his faults, had insisted she have a proper education. Numbers were her friends. They were logical. They followed rules. They didn't have hidden motives. Her fingers traced the columns. Within an hour, she had found 3 accounting errors and reorganized the entire page. Her handwriting neat and clear. She created a new section, projecting the costs of feed against the variable market prices, showing him the exact point at which he would turn a profit. Cole stared at the page, then at her. A flicker of something respect. Surprise showed in his eyes. "Where did you learn to do that?" "My mother taught me," she said simply. She believed a woman's mind was as important as her marriage prospects. From then on, the ledgers became her domain. It was a small thing, but it was a start. It was the first time in her life she felt useful for something other than being a bartered bride. And as she worked, a fragile trust began to grow between them, as quiet and tentative as the first green shoots of spring under the snow. But the world outside the ranch's fences could not be held back forever. On the 4th day, as the storm finally began to break, Hank rode in from checking the southern boundary. "Boss," he said, his face grim as he dismounted in the slushy yard. "2 riders, just sitting their horses on the ridge, watching the house. Don't know 'em. When they saw me, they took off." A knot of ice formed in Abby's stomach. They were looking for her. The next day brought the law. Deputy Ezra Pike was a young man, barely older than Abby herself, with an earnest face and an ill-fitting uniform. He looked profoundly uncomfortable as he sat his horse in front of the porch, his gaze shifting between Cole and the toes of his own boots. "Afternoon, Cole," he said, his voice strained. Ezra, Cole acknowledged. His stance relaxed, but his eyes watchful. He stood on the porch, a silent barrier between the deputy and the house where Abby was hidden just inside the door, listening with a hammering heart. "Cole, I'm here on official business," Pike began, clearing his throat. "Silas Burke filed a report in town. Says his intended bride, a Miss Abigail Rowan, has gone missing. He's concerned she may have been taken against her will." The deputy finally met Cole's eyes. He mentioned his men tracked her footprints in the snow for a ways before the storm wiped them out. They led in this direction. The unspoken accusation was as sharp as the winter air. "Is that so?" Cole said, his voice dangerously level. "He's a powerful man." "Cole," Pike said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "He's got the judge in his pocket. You know that. The whole town is talking. He's spreading the story of his poor, lost bride. It wouldn't be wise for a man to be caught, harboring a runaway, especially one promised to him." Cole was silent for a long moment, the newly hung wind chimes tinkling softly in the breeze. Abby held her breath, certain this was the moment he would turn her over. She was trouble. She was a threat to his peace, to the sanctuary he had built. But when Cole spoke, his voice was like granite. "I'm harboring a traveler who was caught in the storm. Ezra, a young woman who nearly froze to death on my doorstep. That's all I'm doing. If Mr. Burke has a problem, he can ride out here and tell me himself." It was a direct challenge. Deputy Pike paled slightly. He nodded, a jerky, nervous motion. "All right, Cole, I've delivered my warning. Just be careful." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Cole turned and came back inside, his face a grim mask. He didn't look at Abby, but she felt the weight of his decision settle over the room. He had drawn a line not just for the law, but for her. He had chosen to stand on her side of it. The knowledge was both terrifying and exhilarating. That night, she couldn't sleep. The danger she had brought to this quiet, decent man and his home weighed on her conscience. Silas would not give up. He would use his money, his power, and his men to get what he considered his property. The satchel with her book lay by her makeshift bed. The envelope she had snatched in her flight was still inside. She didn't even know what it contained, only that it had been on the desk where Silas and her father had made their foul bargain. Driven by a new, cold fear that the house might be searched, she slipped out from under the blankets. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long shadows across the room. She retrieved the envelope from her bag. By the dim light, she crept to the stone hearth. One of the floorboards near the edge was slightly loose, using the tip of her mother's silver hairpin. She carefully worked at the edge until she could pry it up just enough. The space beneath was dark and filled with the scent of old dust and dry earth. Her hands trembling, she slid the envelope into the dark void. She pushed the board back into place, making sure it was flush and secure. It was no longer just a piece of paper she'd taken by accident. It was a secret, a weapon, perhaps by hiding it within the very foundation of Cole's house. She was no longer just a guest seeking temporary shelter. She was anchoring herself to this place, tying her fate to his. The fence around the Hartman ranch had become her sanctuary, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it could just as easily become her cage. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 3, Footprints Around the Fence Line. Asterisk, asterisk. The thaw came not as a gentle promise, but as a messy, reluctant surrender. The world turned to slush and mud, and the air, while no longer bitingly cold, carried a damp chill that seeped into the bones. It was Luther who found the first sign of trouble. He'd been riding the western perimeter, where the grazing land sloped down toward the frozen Powder River, when he saw it. 2 clean, sharp cuts in the barbed wire, the ends curling back on themselves like wounded snakes, and in the mud, nearly obscured, were the prints of shod horses, not his, not Hank's, and not Cole's. He rode back to the ranch house hard, his young face set in a grim line. Cole was in the barn, mending a harness, the familiar, rhythmic work a balm to his restless mind. He looked up as Luther dismounted, sensing the urgency in the younger man's movements. "Boss," Luther said, his breath fogging in the air. "Wires cut, west fence, by the river bend, 2 strands, and tracks. They sat their horses there for a while, just watching." Cole's hand stilled on the leather strap. He felt a cold, familiar tightening in his gut. This was how it started, not with a direct confrontation, but with a slow, creeping pressure, like a wolf circling a herd, testing for weakness. It was a message from Silas Burke, written in clipped wire and mud. Asterisk, I can reach you. I can take what is yours. His cattle, the lifeblood of his ranch, were now vulnerable, easily scattered or driven off in the night. He straightened up, his movements deliberate. "Hank," he called out. The older man appeared from a stall, a pitchfork in his hand. Cole's voice was low, devoid of emotion. "Ride with Luther. Take wire and tools. Fix the fence, then check the entire perimeter. I want to know if there are any other breaks." As they rode out, Cole stood for a long moment, staring at the empty yard. He was no stranger to conflict. He had fought off rustlers and dealt with the harsh justice of the frontier. But this was different. This wasn't about cattle. It was about the woman sleeping by his hearth. He had drawn a line, and Silas Burke was now preparing to cross it. He went inside. Abby was at the long table, her head bent over the ranch ledgers, a picture of quiet concentration. She had brought an order to his finances that had been missing for years. The soft scratching of her pen was a peaceful sound in the quiet house. He hated that he was about to shatter that peace. "Abby," he said. She looked up, a small smile on her face that faded when she saw his expression. "What is it?" "Burke's men were here. They cut the fence line." The color drained from her face. She put the pen down, her hands clasping in her lap. "It's my fault," she whispered, the words heavy with guilt. "I've brought this on you." "No," Cole said, his voice firm. "This is on him, but it means we have to be smart. We need supplies from town, and I think it's best we all go. Naomi, too. There's safety in numbers." The trip to Willow Bluff was a trial. The town, which had once seemed a place of simple commerce, now felt hostile. Faces that had previously offered a polite nod now turned away. Whispers followed them like shadows as they moved from the mercantile to the blacksmith. Silas Burke had been busy, poisoning the well of public opinion. The story he'd woven was simple and ugly. A rich, benevolent man, robbed of his innocent, perhaps slightly foolish, young bride by an opportunistic, solitary rancher. It was in the general store that the whispers found their voice. While Cole was negotiating the price of rock salt with the proprietor, Abby wandered over to a display of sewing threads. 2 women, wives of local merchants, stood nearby, their voices a low, venomous buzz. "That's her," one of them muttered, her gaze sharp and disapproving. "The Rowan girl. No better than she ought to be. Running off like that. Threw herself at him. They say, a man like Hartman, alone all this time. Well, you know how that is." The other woman clucked her tongue, a disgrace to her father, and poor Mr. Burke, such a generous man to our town, left standing at the altar. It's a scandal. Each word was a physical blow. Abby felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She wanted to shrink, to disappear. She turned away, her eyes stinging, and nearly collided with a small, straight-backed woman with intelligent, dark eyes and hair pulled into a severe bun. The woman was of Chinese descent, her expression one of weary resignation, as if she had heard 1,000 such conversations before. "Pay them no mind, child," the woman said, her voice surprisingly soft but laced with steel. "The words of fools are like tumbleweeds. They make a lot of noise but have no roots." She gave Abby a brief, penetrating look. "I am Miriam Cho. I run the boarding house. My husband worked on Burke's Railroad. I know what kind of man he is." She paused, her gaze flicking toward Cole. "Your host is a good man, but he has chosen a hard fight. If you find you need a friend in this town, my door is open." The unexpected kindness was a lifeline. "Thank you," Abby managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. Miriam Cho simply nodded and moved on, leaving Abby with a small, precious spark of hope. The ride back to the ranch was quiet and tense. The rumors had done their work, isolating them, painting them as outcasts. Cole's jaw was set like stone. He had known this would be part of the fight, but hearing the town's judgment fall upon Abby ignited a cold, protective fury within him. That evening, he gathered everyone in the main room. Hank and Luther stood by the door, their faces grim. Naomi sat beside Abby on the couch, her hand resting reassuringly on her arm. "They're trying to break us from the outside," Cole said, pacing before the fire. "They'll try to break us from the inside next. They cut the fence to spook the cattle. Next time, it might be a fire in the hay barn. Or worse." He stopped and looked at his men. "You signed on to be cowboys, not guards. Burke is a powerful man. There's no shame in riding on. I'll pay you a full season's wages." Hank, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard years, didn't hesitate. "When my wife was sick, you paid the doctor's bill. When Luther's boy fell and broke his arm, you rode 20 miles in the dark to fetch him yourself. We ain't going nowhere, boss." Luther nodded in fierce agreement. "This is our home, too. We stand with you." Cole looked at them, and for a moment, the mask of the stoic rancher slipped, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath. "I'm in your debt," he said, his voice rough. He then turned his attention to the women. "Naomi, you know how to use a rifle. Abby, I think it's time you learned." Abby's head shot up. "A gun? I've never even held one." The thought terrified her. A gun was an instrument of violence, of finality. It was Naomi who answered, her tone practical. "It's not about wanting to use it, Abby, it's about knowing how, so you pray you never have to." Out here, a woman's safety is her own responsibility. Cole can't be everywhere at once. The next afternoon, Naomi took her to a clearing behind the barn. The handgun she produced from a worn leather holster was a Colt Peacemaker. It felt impossibly heavy and cold in Abby's hand. "It's not a toy," Naomi said, her voice all business. She showed her how to check if it was loaded, how to hold it with 2 hands to steady her aim, how to line up the sights on a row of tin cans set on a log. "Respect it. Don't ever point it at anything you don't intend to shoot. Squeeze the trigger. Don't jerk it. Let the noise surprise you." Abby's hands trembled. Her first shot went wide, kicking up a cloud of dirt. The noise was deafening, a violent crack that made her flinch. The recoil jolted up her arm. She hated it. She hated the smell of gunpowder and the power she held in her hands. But she looked at Naomi's patient face, thought of the whispers in town and the cut fence wire, and she lifted the gun again. She fired until the cylinder was empty, hitting one of the cans with a satisfying *ping* on her last shot. She didn't feel powerful. She felt a grim, somber resolve. She was no longer just a victim. She was a survivor, learning the hard language of this land. From the porch, Cole watched. He saw her fear and her determination. Every shot was a reminder of the danger he had allowed into his sanctuary. He was teaching a scholar to hold a weapon, forcing her to learn the brutal grammar of violence because of a choice he had made. The guilt was a bitter taste in his mouth. As night fell, a new tension settled over the ranch. Cole laid out the rules. No one was to ride alone. A lantern would burn in the main barn all night. Hank would take the first watch, Luther the second. They were no longer just ranchers. They were soldiers in a quiet, undeclared war. Amid the tension, life went on. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, Abby would sit with Luther's 7-year-old son, Daniel, patiently guiding him through the letters in a tattered primer. The boy was bright but shy, and under her gentle tutelage, he began to piece words together. One evening, sitting by the fire, he triumphantly read a full sentence aloud for the first time. The look of pure, unadulterated pride on his face was a light in the gathering gloom. Cole watched them from his chair, and the sound of the boy's halting words and Abby's quiet encouragement was a melody that fought against the harsh silence he'd grown so accustomed to. This was what they were protecting. Not just land and cattle, but this fragile, burgeoning community, a family of a kind. Later that night, unable to sleep, Cole pulled on his coat and walked out into the cold. The moon was a silver sliver in the sky, casting a pale light on the muddy, scarred land. He found himself walking toward the Powder River. The thick sheet of ice that had covered it for months was groaning under the pressure of the thaw. As he stood on the bank, a loud crack echoed in the stillness. Sharp as a rifle shot, a long, dark fissure raced across the surface of the ice. He stared at it, his breath held tight in his chest. For 2 years, he had been frozen, locked in a winter of grief and self-recrimination. He had sealed himself off, believing he deserved the solitude, the emptiness. But now, something was breaking. Abby's arrival, the threat from Burke, the loyalty of his men, it was all chipping away at the ice. He could feel the current of life moving beneath the surface, powerful and terrifying. To feel again, to care again, was to be vulnerable again. To fight for this woman was to risk a loss as profound as the one he had already endured. The cracking ice was the sound of his own heart, breaking free from its self-imposed prison, whether he was ready for it or not. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 4. The Thawing Riverbank asterisk, asterisk. The world was coming alive again, but it was an ugly birth. The snow receded to reveal a landscape of thick, sucking mud that pulled at the hooves of the horses and the boots of the men. The task was to move 100 head of yearlings from the winter-worn lower pasture to the higher ground where the first hints of green were beginning to show. It was grueling, relentless work. Abby, mounted on a steady, placid mare named June, found a surprising rhythm in the chaos. She was no cowboy, but she could follow instructions. She learned the feel of the horse moving beneath her, the way to angle her body to turn a stray calf back toward the herd, the low, calming calls the men used. She worked alongside Cole, Hank, and Luther, a small, determined figure against the vast, gray sky. The mud splattered her borrowed denims, the wind chapped her face, and her muscles screamed with a fatigue she had never known. And yet, she felt more alive, more a part of something than she ever had in her father's quiet, suffocating house. She watched Cole. He moved with an economy of motion that was beautiful to behold, a seamless union of man and horse. He was the calm center of the controlled storm, his low voice cutting through the bawling of the cattle, his presence a constant reassurance. For the first time, she saw him not just as her protector, but as the master of his domain, a man in his element. His grief-stricken solitude burned away by the demands of the land. In their shared labor, a new kind of intimacy formed, forged in mud and sweat and the silent understanding of a job that needed doing. By late afternoon, the last of the yearlings were safely in the new pasture. Hank and Luther headed back to the main barn to tend to the rest of the stock, their weary waves a sign of a day's work well done. Cole and Abby remained, riding the new fence line one last time to ensure the herd was settled. They stopped on a low bluff overlooking the Powder River. The river was a living, breathing creature. The great sheet of ice had shattered into a flotilla of churning, grinding flows, the water beneath a muddy, roiling brown. The air was filled with the sound of it, a constant, deep groaning, punctuated by the sharp crack of ice breaking apart. It was the sound of a great unburdening, of a power long held in check finally breaking free. They dismounted by a cluster of cottonwoods, their bare branches stark against the sky. They let the horses drink from a clear-running tributary. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The shared exhaustion, a comfortable silence between them. They were alone. Truly alone. For the first time since she had arrived. "You did well today," Cole said, his voice quiet, his gaze on the churning river. "You have a feel for the work." "I just tried not to fall off," she replied with a small, weary smile. The simple praise warmed her more than the thin sunlight. But the shared work and the raw power of the river had loosened something in her. The secrets she carried felt heavier than ever. A dishonesty to this man who had offered her his protection without question. The time for partial truths was over. "Cole," she began, her voice barely a whisper. She hugged her arms around herself, not from the cold, but to hold herself together. "I haven't been entirely honest with you." He turned to face her, his expression patient, waiting. He leaned against the trunk of a cottonwood, giving her the space she needed. "My father's arrangement with Silas Burke, it wasn't just for a dowry. It was to silence me." She took a deep, shuddering breath, and the words began to pour out. A torrent to match the river before them. "Silas has been cheating the railroad, his own company, for years. He has an accountant, a man named Peters, who has been cooking the books, creating false invoices for labor and supplies that were never delivered. My father found out, I don't know how, but instead of exposing him, he used it. He used it to get the mining concession he's always wanted. My marriage to Silas was the price of his silence." She watched his face, saw the tightening of his jaw, the hardening of his eyes. He wasn't looking at her with judgment, but with a dawning, terrible understanding. "The night I ran away," she continued, her voice gaining a desperate urgency, "I took something from my father's desk, an envelope. I didn't even know what it was. I just grabbed it. It's a letter. Cole, from the accountant, Peters, to Silas. It lays out the whole scheme. It's a confession. He was afraid Silas was going to betray him, so he wrote it all down as insurance." She finally looked him straight in the eye, the full weight of her confession in her gaze. "It's hidden under the floorboards by your hearth. That's why Silas is so desperate to get me back. It's not about a broken promise. It's about a piece of paper that could send him to prison." The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches above them. The grinding of the ice on the river was the only other sound. Cole pushed himself off the tree and took a step toward her. The chasm of his own past had opened at his feet. "He would have hurt you," Cole said. And it wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, cold and hard as iron. "To keep you quiet." "He would have owned me," she corrected softly. "And I would have disappeared." She had laid her greatest vulnerability at his feet. She had shown him the true depth of the danger she had brought to his door. She expected him to be angry, to feel betrayed, to finally tell her she had to leave. Instead, he looked past her, at the turbulent water, and a shadow crossed his face. A pain so deep it seemed to hollow him out from the inside. "I know about disappearing," he said, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. He finally shared the burden he had carried in silence for 2 long years. He spoke of Eleanor, of her laughter that used to fill the big, empty house. He spoke of his son, Thomas, a small boy with his mother's eyes who loved the smell of horses and the taste of wild strawberries. "It was diphtheria," he said, his voice flat, stripped of all emotion. "It came fast. The doctor couldn't do anything. I watched them both. I watched them struggle for every breath. I'm a man who can break a wild horse, who can face down a blizzard, who can build a life out of nothing but dirt and determination." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a terrible, raw self-loathing. "And I couldn't do a single thing to save them. I just sat there, helpless. I held their hands while the fever took them. It wasn't bravery or strength. It was cowardice. I should have been able to stop it." He kicked at a loose stone on the riverbank, the small act of violence, a stark contrast to his story of powerlessness. After the funeral, I locked the door to their rooms. I took down the wind chimes. I just existed. I kept the ranch running because it was the only thing I knew how to do. But I was hiding. Hiding from the quiet. Hiding from the fact that I had failed the only two people who mattered. That's my own prison, Abby, and I put myself in it. The air between them was now charged with the weight of 2 lifetimes of pain. All the boundaries, all the carefully constructed walls, had been washed away by the flood of their confessions. She saw him then, not as the strong, silent rancher, but as a man drowning in a grief as vast and cold as the Montana winter. Without thinking, she reached out and laid her hand on his forearm. His muscles were tense beneath the worn fabric of his coat. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face, his expression one of utter desolation. "You weren't a coward." "Cole," she whispered, her voice fierce with a conviction that came from the very core of her being. "You were a husband. You were a father. You stayed. You didn't run. Staying is the hardest part." His shoulders slumped. A barely perceptible surrender. The armor he had worn for 2 years had finally cracked. He reached out, his rough, calloused hand covering hers, his thumb gently stroking her skin. It was a touch that spoke of a shared sorrow, of a loneliness recognized. He pulled her gently toward him, and she went without hesitation, stepping into the circle of his arms. He held her, not with passion, but with a desperate, protective tenderness. She rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart. She could smell the scent of leather, wood smoke, and the cold, clean air on him. Here, in his arms, by the roaring, thawing river, she felt an impossible sense of peace. She felt safe. She felt home. She tilted her head back to look up at him, her thoughts coming together in a quiet, simple revelation. She spoke the words softly, a narrative of her own heart that she was only just now understanding. "I was promised to another," she said, her voice clear and steady in the cold air. "A virgin bride ran to the rich cowboy, and I think his love is what makes me stay." The word of love hung between them, not as a romantic declaration, but as a truth she had discovered in his actions and the warmth he'd offered, the shelter he'd given, the line he'd drawn against the world for her. It was in his quiet respect, his fierce protection, his shared vulnerability. Cole looked down at her, his blue eyes searching hers. The grief was still there, a shadow in their depths. But for the first time, she saw something else flicker to life beside it. Hope. He slowly lowered his head, giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't. His lips met hers, gently at first, a tentative question. It was not a kiss of fire and demand, but one of profound relief and quiet discovery. It tasted of the cold air and a shared, unspoken sorrow. But beneath it was the warmth of a hearth finally rekindled. It was a promise made not with words, but with a simple, profound connection that acknowledged the pain of the past and dared to look toward a future. When they broke apart, the world seemed different. The sound of the river was no longer a groan of pain, but a song of release. Abby felt a new strength solidify within her, a resolve as firm as the bedrock beneath the river. She looked from Cole's face to the churning water. The ice was breaking, moving, being carried away. She would not be frozen any longer either. "I'm done running," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound clarity. "That envelope, it's not just insurance anymore. It's a weapon. I want to fight him. Cole. Not with guns, but with the law, with the truth." He looked at her, a slow smile touching his lips for the first time since she had met him. It transformed his face, chasing away the last of the shadows. He was no longer a ghost in his own life. The river was flowing free, and so were they. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 5. The Railroad and the Envelope, asterisk, asterisk. The ride to Willow Bluff the next morning was charged with a nervous, palpable energy. The world felt freshly washed, the air sharp and clear after the long thaw. Abby rode beside Cole, the satchel containing her book and the fateful envelope resting on her lap. Before they left, she had retrieved it from beneath the floorboards, the paper feeling both flimsy and incredibly heavy in her hand. This was it, the moment she stopped running and started fighting back. They bypassed the mercantile and the main thoroughfare, heading straight for the small, unassuming building that housed the sheriff's office. Deputy Ezra Pike was at his desk, staring into a mug of cold coffee. When they walked in, he looked up, and the weary apprehension on his face was instantly replaced by a jolt of alarm. "Cole, Miss Rowan," he stammered, standing up so quickly he nearly knocked over his chair. "Ezra," Cole said, his voice calm and steady. He shut the door behind them, granting them a fragile privacy. "We're not here to cause trouble. We're here because we believe in the law, and right now, you represent the law in this town." Abby stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She placed the satchel on the desk and took out the envelope. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when she spoke, was clearer than she'd ever heard it. "Deputy Pike, when you came to the ranch, you warned us that Mr. Burke was telling people I was a runaway. You said he was concerned for my welfare." She slid the envelope across the desk toward him. "This is why he is truly concerned." Pike looked at the envelope as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. He didn't touch it. "Silas Burke is a thief," Abby stated, her words sharp and precise. "He has been defrauding the Union Pacific Railroad, and my father found out. My marriage to him was meant to be the price for my family's silence. This letter is a confession from his accountant. It details the entire scheme. It's the truth." Cole added, his voice a low rumble. "We're not asking you to arrest him on the spot. Ezra, we know who he is, who he knows. We want you to make an official copy of this document. We want the original sent by secured mail to the district prosecutor in Miles City. We want this done by the book, so that the law can take its course, away from the influence of Judge Whitaker." Pike stared at the letter, then at their determined faces. Sweat beaded on his upper lip. He was a young man who had taken the job because he believed in order, in right and wrong. But he was caught between the abstract ideal of justice and the very real, very dangerous power of Silas Burke. To do this would be to declare war on the most powerful man in the county. To refuse would be to betray the badge on his chest. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Finally, with a trembling hand, he reached out and took the envelope. "All right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "All right, I'll do it." The relief was so immense, Abby felt lightheaded. It was a single, crucial step. But in a town as small as Willow Bluff, secrets had the lifespan of a moth. Before the ink was even dry on Pike's official copy, word of their visit had reached Silas Burke. His response was swift and brutal. It came not in the form of armed men, but on a piece of paper delivered by a frantic-looking Ezra Pike that very afternoon. He rode into the Hartman yard, his horse lathered, holding the document as if it burned his fingers. Cole met him on the porch, Abby standing just inside the doorway. "It's from Judge Whitaker," Pike said, his face pale. He wouldn't meet their eyes. "Burke filed a formal complaint. He's accusing you, Cole, of abduction, of holding Miss Rowan against her will and using slanderous forgeries to defame him." He held out the paper. "It's a writ of restitution. It orders the immediate return of Abigail Rowan to the legal guardianship of Mr. Burke until a formal hearing can be held." The legal language was a smokescreen for what it truly was, a kidnapping order, sanctioned by a corrupt court. "You can't be serious," Abby breathed. "Stepping out onto the porch, he can't do that." "With Judge Whitaker, he can do whatever he wants," Cole said, his voice a low growl. He took the paper from Pike's hand, his eyes scanning the formal, flowing script. He wasn't looking at the words. He was looking at the declaration of war they represented. He looked at the young deputy, whose face was a mask of misery. And you're supposed to enforce this. Cole, my hands are tied, Pike pleaded. It's a direct order from the judge. If I don't... I know, Cole cut him off, a surprising note of understanding in his voice. You're caught in the middle. He folded the writ and tucked it into his pocket. You can go back and tell the judge that Miss Rowan is a guest in my home. She is not a prisoner, and she is not property. She will remain here, under my protection. If he wants to enforce his piece of paper, he can come and do it himself. The deputy looked from Cole's iron resolve to Abby's defiant stance. He gave a single, jerky nod, then turned and rode away, a man torn in two. The news of the writ, meant to isolate and intimidate them, had the opposite effect. It was too much, too blatant. The whispers in town began to change. Burke was no longer a jilted victim. He was a bully, using the law as a club. The shift was felt most keenly in the town's small, segregated Chinese quarter. Miriam Cho heard the news from a freight worker, and her face, usually a mask of stoic calm, hardened with resolve. She had remained silent for too long, watching Burke exploit her countrymen, men who had laid the tracks that were the source of his wealth. They were paid a pittance, charged exorbitant rates for food and lodging at the company store, and treated as less than human. Her own husband had died from a preventable accident, his death dismissed as the cost of progress. That evening, she gathered 3 of the oldest laborers in the back room of her boarding house. They were terrified, their eyes darting toward the windows. To speak against Silas Burke was to risk everything. He is trying to take the girl back, Miriam said in her native Cantonese, her voice low and firm. He uses the law to call her his property, the same way he uses his contracts to call your labor his property. She opened a heavy, dog-eared ledger on the table. For years, she had been keeping her own set of books. Her penmanship was as precise as an architect's drawing. She had recorded every discrepancy, the wages promised versus the wages paid, the illegal deductions for tools, the names of men who had been injured and then fired without a cent. It was a meticulous, damning record of systematic exploitation. We have been silent because we are afraid, she said, her dark eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. But our silence is his strength. If we speak now, for this girl, we also speak for ourselves, for your sons, for my husband. It took an hour, but her quiet courage was infectious. By the time they left, she had their sworn statements, marked with their signatures. The next morning, she walked into Deputy Pike's office, the ledger under her arm, and laid a second, even more powerful weapon on his desk. The escalation came that night. The wind rose as the sun went down, a dry, malevolent force that moaned through the eaves of the ranch house and rattled the window panes. It was the kind of wind that could turn a spark into an inferno in the blink of an eye. Cole felt it first, a gut-level unease that made him get up from the dinner table and walk to the window. In the distance, against the ink-black sky, a strange orange light flickered. It grew with impossible speed. "Fire!" he yelled, his voice cracking like a whip. He burst out the door, the others scrambling behind him. The sight that met them was a vision from hell. The massive haystack, 100 of tons of dry winter feed, was a roaring pyramid of flame, and the wind was driving a blizzard of burning embers directly toward the main cattle barn, 100 yards away. The attack was diabolically clever. It wasn't aimed at them, but at their livelihood. Panic and chaos erupted. The cattle in the barn, smelling the smoke, began to bellow in terror. Cole's voice cut through the roar of the fire and the wind. "Hank, Luther, get the horses out, move them to the far corral. Naomi, to the trough, start the bucket line. Abby, with me." There was no time for fear. Adrenaline surged through Abby, sharp and hot. She ran alongside Cole to the water trough, grabbing one of the heavy wooden buckets. They formed a desperate chain, Naomi and Abby filling the buckets, Cole and his men running them toward the barn, throwing the pitifully small amounts of water against the barn's windward wall, which was already beginning to smoke. It was a battle against a monster. The heat was immense, scorching their faces. The smoke was a thick, acrid blanket that tore at their lungs and blinded them. Burning embers rained down around them, setting small fires in the dry grass, which they frantically stomped out. Abby's arms ached, her lungs burned, and her eyes streamed, but she didn't stop. She filled bucket after bucket, her movements becoming a numb, desperate rhythm. This was her home they were burning. These were her people. She worked beside Cole, a silent, soot-stained partner in a desperate fight. She saw the grim determination on his face, the fierce, protective light in his eyes, and she felt a surge of love for him so powerful it eclipsed her fear. They were fighting for more than a barn. They were fighting for the future they had only just begun to imagine by the riverbank. For what felt like an eternity, they battled the inferno, a tiny island of defiance against a sea of destruction. The hayrick was a lost cause, but they focused all their energy on the barn. They soaked blankets and hung them over the most threatened sections. They beat at the glowing embers that landed on the roof with wet sacks. Slowly, impossibly, they began to gain ground. The main fury of the hayrick fire began to die down, consuming the last of its fuel. The wind, as if its malevolent work was done, began to ease. They had held the line. The barn was still standing, its side blackened and scorched, but intact. The cattle were safe. They collapsed in the muddy yard, gasping for air, their face black with soot, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and reaction. They had won. It was then that they heard the sound of a horse approaching at a gallop. Out of the darkness rode Deputy Ezra Pike. He had seen the glow in the sky from town and had ridden out, his heart in his throat. He reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the scene, the smoldering mountain of ash, the scorched barn, the 5 exhausted figures who looked like soldiers emerging from a battlefield. He saw Cole putting a protective arm around Abby's shoulders. He saw the loyalty and defiance in the faces of the ranch hands. He saw the clear, unadulterated evil of the attack. Any lingering conflict within him died in that moment, burned away by the embers of the fire. This was no longer a legal dispute. This was a violent, criminal assault. His fear of Silas Burke was finally eclipsed by his duty to the law he had sworn to uphold. He dismounted, his face grim. His choice made. "Cole," he said, his voice hard with a new authority. "Tell me everything." **, Part 6, The Hearing at Willow Bluff. **. The courtroom in Willow Bluff was not a grand hall of justice. It was a single, stuffy room with wooden benches, smelling of old paper, stale tobacco, and the collective anxiety of the 20 or so people crammed inside. Every seat was taken. Townspeople, ranchers from neighboring spreads, and a quiet, watchful contingent of Chinese railroad workers stood shoulder to shoulder along the back wall. The air was thick with tension, a silence that was heavier than any sound. At the front, Silas Burke sat beside his slick, well-dressed lawyer from Miles City. Burke looked perfectly composed, a portrait of aggrieved dignity. He was dressed in a fine wool suit, his silver hair neatly combed, his expression one of paternal concern for the misguided young woman at the opposite table. But his eyes, when they occasionally flicked toward Abby, were as cold and hard as river stones. Abby sat beside Cole, under the table. His hand rested near hers, not touching, but a solid, reassuring presence. Naomi sat directly behind them, a silent pillar of support. Beside them was Deputy Ezra Pike, looking transformed. The nervous uncertainty was gone, replaced by a rigid, formal posture. He was wearing his badge, but today it seemed to shine with a new authority. At the head of the room, on a raised dais, sat Judge Whitaker. He tapped his gavel. The sound unnaturally loud in the tense quiet. "This hearing is called to order," he announced, his voice booming with a self-importance that did little to hide the nervous tremor in his jowls. "We are here to address the writ of restitution concerning one Miss Abigail Rowan, and the ancillary complaints filed by Mr. Silas Burke. Burke's lawyer rose, a man whose smile never reached his eyes. He painted a masterful picture. He spoke of a loving, concerned fiancé. He described a young, impressionable girl, perhaps overwhelmed by the prospect of marriage, who had been taken in and had her mind poisoned by a reclusive, bitter rancher. The accountant's letter, he argued, was a pathetic, obvious forgery, a desperate fiction concocted by a man trying to steal another's bride. All Mr. Burke wants, the lawyer concluded, his voice dripping with false sincerity, is to bring his betrothed home, to care for her and protect her from the dangerous influence she has fallen under. When he sat down, a murmur went through the room. The story was plausible, playing on all the common prejudices. Judge Whittaker nodded sagely, as if the matter were already settled. Thank you, Counselor. A clear and concise summary. Now, Miss Rowan, do you have anything to say before I uphold my order? This was the moment. Cole gave her hand a brief, firm squeeze under the table. She took a steadying breath and rose. She did not look like a victim, dressed in a simple but well-mended dress of Naomi's, her hair tied back neatly. She looked composed and resolute. She held a folded piece of paper in her hand. "My name is Abigail Rowan," she began, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "I am not misguided, and I have not been abducted." She looked directly at Silas Burke. I ran away because this man did not ask for my hand in marriage. He purchased it. He purchased my life, my future, and my silence in a business transaction with my father." Her voice grew stronger with every word. Fueled by the truth, she was finally allowed to speak. She recounted the conversation she had overheard, the talk of mining concessions and dowries. Then she unfolded the letter. "This is not a forgery," she said, her eyes now on Judge Whittaker. "This is a letter written by Mr. Albert Peters, Mr. Burke's accountant, to his employer. It details how Mr. Burke has been systematically defrauding the railroad by creating phantom payrolls and falsifying supply invoices. It is the reason Mr. Burke wants me back, not out of love, but out of fear." She handed the letter to Deputy Pike, who stood and presented it to the clerk as evidence. Burke's lawyer was on his feet, shouting objections about hearsay and inadmissible evidence. But Abby wasn't finished. "And Mr. Burke's exploitation is not limited to his business partners," she said, her voice ringing with passion. She turned to the back of the courtroom. Miriam Cho. A path cleared, and the small, stoic owner of the boarding house walked to the front. She held her own ledger in her hands. She did not look at Burke. She addressed the court. "My name is Miriam Cho," she said, her English clear and precise. "My husband died building Mr. Burke's railroad. For 5 years, I have watched him hire my countrymen with promises of fair wages. And for 5 years, I have watched him cheat them." She opened her ledger, page by page. She laid bare the rot at the heart of Burke's empire. She read names, dates, and amounts. She read of wages withheld, of men forced to buy from the company store at triple the price, of injuries ignored and families left destitute. As she spoke, 2 of the old railroad workers came and stood behind her, their silent presence a powerful testament to her words. The courtroom was utterly silent. The townspeople of Willow Bluff hearing for the first time the story of the silent, invisible community that lived among them. When she was finished, the atmosphere in the room had changed completely. The whispers were no longer of a runaway bride, but of a cruel, rapacious tyrant. Judge Whittaker was visibly sweating now. He slammed his gavel down. "This is a farce, a collection of lies and slander. I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus. The testimony of these people is irrelevant to the matter at hand. The writ stands. Deputy, you will take Miss Rowan into your custody and deliver her to Mr. Burke." But Ezra Pike did not move. He remained standing, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "I'm afraid I can't do that. Your Honor," he said, his voice hard and clear. "What did you say?" Deputy Whitaker roared, his face turning a blotchy red. "I said I can't do that," Pike repeated, "because this is no longer just a hearing, it's an investigation." He produced a second, smaller ledger from inside his coat. "After the arson at the Hartman Ranch, I did some digging of my own. I found Mr. Peters, the accountant. He was a scared man. Scared enough to not only confirm the authenticity of his letter, but to give me this." He held up the book. "It's his private record. Your Honor, it details every single payment Mr. Burke has made to you over the past 2 years, disguised as illegal consultation fees." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Silas Burke shot to his feet, his face a mask of fury. Judge Whitaker looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. At that precise moment, the courtroom doors opened. A tall, silver-haired man with a stern, deeply lined face and the unmistakable air of authority strode in. He was a stranger to all but Pike. "Judge Whitaker," the man said, his voice like the crack of a whip, "I believe your services are no longer required." He turned to the stunned room. "I am Judge Henry Wallace of the United States Territorial Circuit Court. Deputy Pike summoned me here 2 days ago in light of credible allegations of arson, fraud, and judicial corruption. Having heard the last 10 minutes of testimony from the hallway, I am now taking full jurisdiction over this matter." The world had just been turned upside down. Judge Wallace moved to the dais, his presence dwarfing the sputtering, terrified Whitaker. He reviewed the letter, Miriam's ledger, and the accountant's bribery book with a sharp, practiced eye. After a long, torturous silence, he looked up. His gaze fell first on Abby. "Miss Rowan, this court finds that you have been the subject of a coercive and illegal contract. The writ of restitution issued by Judge Whitaker is hereby nullified. You are a free woman, under the law's protection." He then looked at the trembling Whitaker. "As for you, sir, you are suspended from the bench pending a federal investigation. Deputy, relieve him of his gavel." Finally, his hard eyes settled on Silas Burke, who stood frozen in disbelief. "Mr. Burke, based on the evidence and testimony presented here, this court is referring your case to the federal prosecutor for charges including, but not limited to, felony fraud, conspiracy, arson, and violations of the Federal Peonage Act of 1867. You are to remain in this territory." It was over. A wave of cheers and applause erupted from the back of the room. Abby sagged against Cole, the strength that had held her up for so long finally giving way to overwhelming relief. He put his arm around her, holding her tight. It was a victory more complete than they could have ever imagined. They moved as a group toward the exit. Cole, Abby, Naomi, Hank, and Luther, with Pike and Miriam Cho following close behind. As they stepped out of the courthouse and into the bright afternoon sun, the crowd spilled out behind them, a wave of support. But the triumph was short-lived. Across the dusty street, positioned behind wagons and in the alleyway beside the saloon, were 4 men. They were hard-faced, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips, and stepping out from between them was Silas Burke, his face twisted into a snarl of pure, desperate rage. The law had failed him. Now he would make his own. "You won't take what's mine. Hartman," he screamed, his voice raw. "None of you will." Panic erupted. The townspeople scrambled for cover. In an instant, the celebratory square was a potential battlefield. Cole reacted instinctively, pushing Abby behind him. "Get back inside," he yelled to Naomi. Hank and Luther fanned out, taking cover behind a water trough, their own revolvers appearing in their hands. They weren't looking for a fight, but they were ready to end one. This, Cole knew, was the final test. Not of his speed with a gun, but of his will to protect. He didn't draw. He stood his ground, a shield for the woman he loved. "It's over," Silas Ezra Pike shouted, stepping forward, his own pistol now drawn and held steady. He was no longer a boy playing at being the law. He was the law. Don't make this worse. You're under federal jurisdiction now. But Burke was beyond reason. He gave a nod to his men. Take the girl. The first shot did not come from Burke's men. It came from the rooftop of the Mercantile, where one of the town's merchants, a man Burke had bullied in a land deal a year prior, leveled a hunting rifle. The shot kicked up a puff of dust at the feet of one of the gunmen, making him jump back. It was a signal. The town had chosen its side. From doorways and windows, other citizens appeared, not all armed with guns, but with a collective, defiant will. Burke's hired men hesitated, their eyes darting around. They had been paid to intimidate a lone rancher, not to fight an entire town. Drop your weapons, Pike commanded, his voice ringing with newfound authority. Cole saw his moment. While Burke's attention was on the deputy, Cole moved. He didn't draw his gun. He lunged forward, closing the distance in 3 long strides. He tackled Burke with the force of a charging bull, sending them both crashing to the ground. The pistol Burke had been pulling from his coat clattered away in the dust. Seeing their employer taken down, 2 of the gunmen threw their weapons down in surrender. The other 2, after a brief, tense standoff with Hank and Luther, followed suit. It was over in seconds, not with a bloody shootout, but with a decisive, coordinated act of community defiance. Pike was on Burke in an instant, hauling him to his feet and wrenching his arms behind his back. He snapped a pair of handcuffs on Burke's wrists, the metallic click echoing in the sudden silence. He shoved the sputtering, defeated man toward the iron railroad survey marker that stood like a squat monument in front of the courthouse. Abby came and stood beside Cole, her hand finding his. He was breathing heavily. His knuckles scraped, but his eyes were clear. The townspeople slowly emerged from their cover, their faces a mixture of fear, relief, and awe. They weren't looking at Cole as a gunslinger who had won a duel. They were looking at him as the man who had stood his ground to protect one of their own, who had faced down a tyrant not with bullets, but with courage. He had become what he had long avoided, a part of the community. A protector. Ezra Pike leaned the handcuffed Silas Burke against the iron marker, the very symbol of the power and oppression he had used to build his corrupt empire. Now, it was the post to which his downfall was tied. The law, with the help of good people, had finally won. Abby was free. ***, Part 7, The New Grass and the Porch. Vow ***. Spring arrived in the Powder River Basin not as a gentle guest, but as a determined force, shouldering aside the last remnants of winter. The mud dried. The great, groaning thaw of the river settled into a steady, life-giving flow, and a vibrant, almost violent green pushed up through the soil. At the Hartman Ranch, it was a season of profound healing, marked by the steady rhythm of hammers and the scent of freshly sawn pine. The aftermath of their victory in town was a quiet, stunned peace. Silas Burke was gone, taken by federal marshals to Miles City to await a trial that was, by all accounts, a foregone conclusion. Judge Whitaker had vanished overnight, leaving his office and his reputation in ruins. The town of Willow Bluff seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, as if a long-standing fever had finally broken. But at the ranch, scars remained. The most visible was the scorched, blackened wall of the main barn and the vast, ashen circle where the haystack had once stood. They became the focus of the ranch's renewed life. Cole, Hank, and Luther, with Abby working tirelessly alongside them, spent the first weeks of spring in a flurry of restorative labor. They scraped the char from the barn walls, replacing the burned timbers with fresh, pale wood that smelled of the forest. They tilled the blackened earth where the fire had been, mixing in fresh soil and scattering handfuls of resilient pasture seed. They rebuilt the fences that Burke's men had cut, and then they built new ones, their posts driven deep, their wires strung tight and true. It was more than simple repair. It was an act of reclamation. With every swing of the hammer, with every handful of seed, they were not just rebuilding a ranch. They were reaffirming their home, fortifying its boundaries against the memory of the violation it had endured. Abby found a deep satisfaction in the physical work. It grounded her, connecting her to the earth and the cycle of renewal happening all around her. She was no longer a guest, a refugee. Her sweat and effort were now woven into the very fabric of the place. She learned the heft of a post-hole digger, the satisfying thud of a maul striking a fence post, and the quiet companionship of working side by side with people who had become her family. One afternoon, as they were finishing the last section of fence, Cole disappeared into the house. He returned a few minutes later, holding something in his hand. It was a new set of wind chimes, crafted from polished copper tubes that caught the afternoon sun. He didn't say a word, simply fetched a small ladder and hung them from the eaves of the front porch, in the exact spot where the old ones had been. He stepped back, and a gentle breeze, sweeping up from the greening valley, stirred them to life. The sound was different from the old chimes, not the tinkling, melancholic memory of what was lost, but a series of clear, resonant, and hopeful tones. It was the sound of a new beginning, a melody for the future. Cole was changing. The change was not dramatic, but a slow, quiet thawing, like the river itself. The deep ingrained solitude that had been his armor for 2 years began to fall away. One morning, he walked into the kitchen to the sound of Abby and Naomi laughing together as they kneaded dough, their hands white with flour. In the past, he would have retreated from the sound, the intrusion of light and life a painful reminder of the silence. This time, he stopped in the doorway, leaning against the frame, and just listened. A slow, unfamiliar smile touched his lips. The sound no longer hurt, it healed. He began to linger after meals, listening to the easy conversation, even adding a quiet story or two of his own. He watched Abby as she continued her lessons with Luther's son, Daniel, her patient voice a gentle murmur in the evenings. He saw the life she had brought back into his home, not just with her presence, but with her spirit. She was the spring that had finally broken his long winter. One evening, he did something he hadn't done since the funeral. He took the old iron key from its hook and walked upstairs to the 2 rooms that had been locked for so long. He opened the door to his son's room first. The air was still and thick with memory. A small wooden horse sat on the floor, waiting for a hand that would never move it. He walked to the window and opened it, letting the fresh, spring air and the sound of the new wind chimes fill the space. He did the same in Eleanor's room, with its scent of dried lavender and the faint indentation still on her pillow. He didn't weep. He stood in the open doorways, allowing the past and the present to mingle, finally understanding that a new life didn't require erasing the old one. It required making peace with it. Love, he was learning, didn't erase scars. It taught you how to live with them. Abby, too, was blossoming in the newfound security of her life. Her mind, once consumed with survival, was now free to look beyond the ranch's fences. She thought often of her own desperate flight, of the terror and helplessness. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that she was not the only one. One evening, as they were reviewing the ranch ledgers, she turned to Cole, her expression serious. "The ranch is doing well," she said, gesturing to the neat columns of figures. "The price for beef is strong." "Thanks to you," he said. "You have a better mind for numbers than any man I know." "I've been thinking," she said, choosing her words carefully. "When I ran, I had nowhere to go. If your light hadn't been on, if you hadn't opened your door, I don't know what would have become of me. There must be other women, Cole, women in towns, on homesteads, who feel just as trapped as I did, but have no way out." She took a breath, her idea taking shape as she spoke it. "I was thinking we could take a small portion of the ranch's profits, just a small amount each season, and set it aside, a fund, a secret fund, for women who need to escape, enough for a coach ticket to a new town, a few weeks' board, A chance to start over. Cole looked at her, his heart swelling with a love and admiration so profound it almost took his breath away. She had taken her own pain and forged it not into bitterness, but into a tool to help others. She was no longer a victim. She was becoming a rescuer. "That's a fine idea, Abby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "A fine idea." The next time they were in town, they went to see Miriam Cho. They found her in the boarding house kitchen, a fragrant cloud of steam and spices swirling around her. They explained Abby's idea. Miriam listened intently, her dark eyes missing nothing. When they were done, she was silent for a long moment, simply wiping her hands on her apron. "In my country," she said finally, "there is a proverb. To save one life is to save the world entire." She looked at Abby with a deep, knowing respect. "It is a dangerous thing you propose, but it is a good thing. I will help you. I will keep the ledger. No one will suspect the quiet widow who runs the boarding house. With their future beginning to take shape, built on a foundation of shared work and a common purpose, there was only one thing left. It was not a matter of law or society, but of the heart. One evening in late May, when the wildflowers were carpeting the pastures and the setting sun was painting the sky in strokes of rose and gold, Cole took Abby's hand and led her out to the front porch. The air was soft and warm. The wind chimes sang their gentle song. "We'll ride to Miles City next month, when the circuit judge returns," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble. "We'll make it legal and proper. But that's for the world. This is for us. He stood before her, his large, calloused hands gently holding hers. His eyes, so often guarded and filled with shadows, were now clear and open, filled with a love so deep and steady it felt like the bedrock of the earth itself. "I don't have pretty words." "Abby," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I only have the truth. For 2 years, this house was a tomb. I was a ghost. You came here in a storm, and you brought the spring with you. You taught me how to breathe again, how to live again. My vow to you is simple. This will always be your home. My heart will always be your shelter. I will stand between you and any storm the world sends your way. I love you." Tears welled in Abby's eyes, blurring the image of his strong, earnest face. She had spent her life feeling like a possession, a commodity. This man was offering her a partnership, a sanctuary, a love that asked for nothing but her own in return. "Cole," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Before I came here, I was a girl with no choices. I was a name in a contract. You gave me a voice. You gave me the safety to find my own strength. You healed a part of me I thought was broken forever." She reached up and untied the simple blue kerchief from where it was now always tied to her wrist. The fabric was worn and soft from 1,000 touches. It was the last, most precious piece of her old life, of the girl she had been. "I don't have a ring to give you," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I only have this. It was my mother's. It represents all that I was. I want you to have it, because my future, all that I will ever be, is with you." She folded the small square of blue cloth and placed it in his palm. He closed his large hand around it, his knuckles white. To him, it was more precious than gold. He looked at it, then back at her, his eyes shining. Without a word, he carefully tucked the kerchief into the breast pocket of his shirt, the small blue square a splash of color over his heart. He framed her face with his hands and kissed her. It was a kiss that held all the quiet evenings, all the shared labor, all the healed wounds, and all the silent promises. It was a vow sealed not with a preacher's words, but with the profound, unshakable truth of two souls who had found their home in one another. They stood on the porch for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, while the new grass grew in the pastures and the wind chimes sang of peace. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 8. The Powder River. After the storm, asterisk, asterisk. Summer settled over the high plains. a season of long, sun-drenched days and cool, star-dusted nights. The new grass in the pastures grew thick and tall, whispering in the wind, burying the last of the scars from the fire. Life at the Hartman Ranch fell into a new rhythm, one of peace and quiet, productive work. It was a peace that had been hard-won, and for that, it was all the more precious. The news from the outside world arrived in early July, brought by a rider in a crisp new uniform. Ezra Pike was now Sheriff Pike, his promotion a direct result of his unwavering conduct during the Burke affair. He sat on the porch with Cole and Abby, a cup of lemonade in his hand, a man who now seemed to wear his authority as comfortably as he wore his own skin. "The federal trial is over," he announced, his gaze steady and clear. Silas Burke was found guilty on all counts: fraud, conspiracy, coercion, arson. The list was long. He took a sip of his lemonade. He won't be seeing the Montana Territory again for a very long time. His assets have been seized by the federal government to pay back the railroad. His power, his entire network, it's all gone, just like that. It was strange, Abby thought, how the end of such a terrifying chapter of her life could arrive so quietly. In a simple conversation on a sunny afternoon, the monster that had haunted her was now just a name in a court docket, a ghost stripped of all its power. She felt a profound sense of release, a final, unburdening exhale. Cole nodded, his expression somber but satisfied. And Judge Whitaker fled, Pike said with a shake of his head. Disappeared the day Judge Wallace arrived. There's a warrant out for him. But a man like that, he knows how to vanish. It doesn't matter. His career is over. The law is cleaning its own house. He stood, placing his cup on the railing. I just wanted you to be the first to know. This town owes you both a great deal. After he rode off, a comfortable silence settled between them. The wind chimes sang their soft, copper-toned melody. Justice had been done, not by a single act of vengeance, but by the slow, grinding wheels of the law, pushed forward by the courage of ordinary people. A few weeks later, they rode into Willow Bluff. The journey was a world away from their previous furtive, anxious trips. Now, they were greeted with smiles and friendly waves. The story of the hearing had become local legend, and Cole and Abby were no longer the outcasts, but the quiet heroes of the tale. They were met on the steps of the new courthouse by Miriam Cho, her usually severe expression softened by a rare, genuine smile. They stood before the new magistrate, a straightforward, no-nonsense man appointed by Judge Wallace. The ceremony was simple, the words plain and unadorned. There were no flowers, no fine clothes, only the three of them, and Miriam and Naomi as their witnesses. As Cole slid a simple, slender gold band onto Abby's finger, he also reached into his breast pocket and took out the small, folded, blue kerchief. "This is the real ring," he whispered, his voice for her alone. He unfolded it and gently tied it around her neck, its soft, worn fabric a familiar comfort against her skin. It was no longer a memento of a past she had fled, but a symbol of the future they were building. When the magistrate pronounced them husband and wife, Cole didn't kiss her with fiery passion, but with a deep, reverent tenderness that spoke of promises kept and a future secured. Life on the ranch deepened, enriched by the new legal bond between them. The days flowed into one another in a seamless, happy rhythm. But as summer began to fade into the golden hues of early autumn, Abby started to feel a change within herself, a new kind of weariness in the mornings, a subtle shift in her body that was both strange and wonderful. She confided first in Naomi, her sister now in both name and heart. They were in the kitchen, canning the last of the summer peaches, the air sweet and warm. Abby paused, a hand resting on her lower abdomen, a thoughtful, wondrous expression on her face. "Naomi," she began, a hint of nervous excitement in her voice. I think there's going to be another Hartman at this ranch come spring." Naomi's hand stilled in the bowl of peeled peaches. Her eyes, so like her brother's, widened, and then a look of pure, unadulterated joy spread across her face. She rushed to Abby, enveloping her in a fierce, protective hug. "Oh, Abby," she laughed, tears shining in her eyes. "That's the best news this house has ever heard." When they told Cole that evening, he was standing by the corral fence, watching the sunset paint the sky. Abby came and stood beside him, taking his hand and placing it on her stomach. He looked at her, confused for a moment, and then he felt it a connection. A message passed without words. His eyes widened, searching hers, and when he saw the joyful, tearful confirmation in her gaze, something inside him that had been merely healed now became whole. He knelt in the dust, his weathered hand spreading gently over the place where his child was growing. He pressed his ear to her dress, as if he could hear the tiny, secret heartbeat within. He didn't speak. He couldn't. A wave of emotion too profound for words washed over him, grief for the son he had lost, overwhelming love for the woman who had saved him, and a fierce, boundless joy for the new life they had created together. He looked up at her, his face streaked with tears, and the love that shone from him was as bright and powerful as the setting sun. To celebrate, they held a small harvest festival at the ranch. It wasn't a grand affair, but an intimate gathering of the family they had built. Hank and Luther brought their wives and children. Miriam Cho rode out from town, bringing with her a special, savory mooncake for the occasion. Sheriff Pike came, too, leaving his badge and his worries in town for the day. As a special tribute, Cole had invited a small band of Apsaluk, the Crow people whose ancestral lands bordered his own. They had been respectful neighbors for years, and he had always admired their dignity and their deep connection to the land. They came not as strangers, but as friends, their brightly colored blankets a vibrant splash against the autumn landscape. They traded smoked fish and intricately beaded leatherwork for flour and salt, their children joining the ranch children in wild, laughing games of tag that darted between the corrals and the barn. The air was filled with the sounds of life, the happy shouts of children, the low murmur of conversation in English and Crow, the sizzle of beef roasting over an open pit, and through it all, the clear, constant music of the copper wind chimes, singing their song of peace and belonging. Cole stood on the porch, Abby by his side, his arm wrapped protectively around her and their unborn child. He looked out at the scene at his loyal men, his brave sister, his trusted friends, and the woman who was his entire world. This was his home, not the logs and stone of the house, but this circle of people, this community, forged in adversity and bound by love. Later, as the last of the guests departed and the first stars began to prick the deep velvet of the sky, they walked hand in hand down to the place where it had all truly begun, the bluff overlooking the Powder River. The river was calm now, a ribbon of silver reflecting the twilight. The roar of the spring thaw was a distant memory, replaced by the gentle, soothing murmur of the current. It was a river at peace, its journey steady and sure. Abby stood looking out at the water, one hand resting on her growing belly, the other unconsciously rising to touch the soft, blue kerchief at her neck. She looked at Cole, his strong profile outlined against the fading light, and her heart was so full she felt it might burst. The entire, impossible journey of the past year coalesced in her mind, a story so incredible it felt like a dream. But it was real. Every fear, every tear, every victory, every quiet moment of love, it was all real. She turned to him, her eyes shining with a love that was as deep and constant as the river before them. She spoke the words softly, not as a memory of a log line, but as the fundamental truth of her own life, a creed she had earned. "I was promised to another," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, powerful grace. A virgin bride ran to the rich cowboy. She smiled, a radiant, beautiful expression of pure joy. And it was his love that made me stay. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to the channel, Wild West Night, and giving this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please hit that hype button to show your support. Your engagement means the world. Thank you.